Okay, hi, my name is Gregg Cassin, and I'm here with Sean Strub from Pause Magazine and the Zero Project. And we're gonna ask a few questions and share a little bit about the Reunion Projects Roundtable that we did over the last couple of days. Really important project where we brought together long-term survivors, people that serve long-term survivors and long-term survivors themselves that work out in the field, and to work at building not only a coalition, but looking at best practices. What exactly do we need to do to empower long-term survivors and the agencies that serve them as to what are the specific needs of long-term survivors, and really starting to focus on what those special needs are. I want to go back to our conversation on the Denver Principles, because the Denver Principles, I feel like it's just, the Denver Principles for folks is an empowerment document that was written in 1983 for people with HIV to claim the power that they must have a seat at the table of all the services and the healthcare delivery, et cetera, for people with HIV. And so it was a really empowered document. It happened at one of the AIDS conferences, right?
Well, it was actually at the 5th National Gay and Lesbian Health Conference. And a group of people with AIDS were there, largely through the effort of a nurse in San Francisco who contacted people around the country and said, you should be there, you should be part of this discussion. And they gathered in a hotel room and compared efforts of what was going on in San Francisco, what was going on in New York. There was no national gay or AIDS activism. There was barely any national gay activism. That was fairly new. And they wrote this document, it was a manifesto, that started by taking control of the language, right? We reject the label victim. It implies passivity and defeat. We are only occasionally patients. We are people with AIDS, people first language. And it outlined a series of rights and responsibilities for people with AIDS, HIV, and the healthcare providers and those caregivers. And it was radical, because it wasn't just the first time that a group of people with AIDS got together and asserted their right to this voice in the policy and decision making that would so profoundly affect our lives. It was the first time in the history of humanity when people who shared a disease, shared a health condition, organized to assert their right to this political voice. And it has been profoundly important in changing healthcare. Its importance is spread worldwide. The ideals reflected in it were really a codification of the women's health movement of the 60s and 70s. And the more contemporary version at UNAIDS sort of created this MIPA-JIPA principles, the greater involvement, meaningful involvement of people with AIDS. And I think a lot of the challenges that we face today in the epidemic, certainly in the US, need to be addressed in part by going back to that foundation document of our movement. Because from that Denver Principles document, in the summer of 1983, we went forth and created this whole parallel system of healthcare service delivery, because the existing healthcare service delivery system, it wasn't interested in serving gay people. It wasn't interested in serving people with HIV, people with AIDS, didn't know how to do it. So we created our own organizations. They were on a very different model. They were almost across the board, a peer-to-peer model. They didn't have boards of directors that sat around and talked about the clients. The clients were on the board. The boards of most of these early AIDS organizations, the big service providers, were mostly people who either had the virus themselves or weren't tested, might have had the virus themselves, and their closest partners and allies. Over time, and as the epidemic institutionalized and all sorts of things changed, those service delivery organizations have incrementally moved towards the more dominant service delivery paradigm, which is a benefactor-victim paradigm, away from that peer-to-peer. And when people sometimes talk, those of us who've been involved in this for a long time and are long-term survivors, we sometimes talk about the 80s in a way that is almost nostalgic, right? Which seems odd. It was, pain and suffering and loss and death beyond description. What we were nostalgic for was that sense of shared purpose.
Yes.
We were creating something new and radical and different, because it wasn't just service provision. It was how we created policy and programs. It was creation of our own media. It was creation of our own clinical trials network. When the drug companies weren't doing the work fast enough or weren't doing it at all, we created our own community clinical trials with our frontline community clinicians. It was very much a sort of do-it-yourself movement where we were focused on each other. When people think about AIDS activism in the 80s, what comes to mind first for most people is the dramatic, theatrical ACT UP demonstrations and street demonstrations, which are very important. I think that was part of saving my life. I was very much a part of it. But the advocacy that preceded that didn't really get into gear until 1987 when ACT UP started. And when that happened, that was externally focused. That wasn't focused on people with HIV on each other. It was focused on the institutions of power, the government, the drug companies, the media, trying to get them to do what they should have been doing all along, and specifically expediting drug development. And then when treatment came out, we sort of fell asleep at the wheel, and we neglected the other issues,
all the other services
around self-empowerment and stigma and bodily autonomy, human rights, confidentiality, privacy, all that range of issues that we were the ones that had sort of created the standard around that, with the belief that we're going to treat our way out of the epidemic. And so now, I think we're at the beginning of a renaissance where people are looking at the ideals reflected in the Denver Principles and are demanding, looking at these AIDS organizations that at one time, most of their board was people with HIV.
Exactly.
Now, if they have anybody on the board, it sometimes is, somebody who's been tokenized, who hasn't been provided the training or the tools to be a really effective board member. And the boards of these organizations are very often quite distant from the communities they're serving. They're well-intentioned. I don't mean to disparage people individually, but there's that distance that's been created. We need to narrow that gap, and we need to support getting people with HIV together with each other. In the first half of the epidemic, when someone was diagnosed, the most important thing was to get them together with someone else who was positive. That was, you got them in a support group, in a network, you got them a buddy, somebody they could talk to and create that beginning sense of community and empowerment. That's how they confront the stigma. That's how they became better. Now that doesn't happen. There's not the funding for that. The first thing is get them on treatment, neutralize them so they can't infect anybody else. Forget about the rest of their life. We need to get back to connecting people again, supporting the networks, and I lost my train of thought.
Okay. I want to ask you, so if we update a current version of the Denver Principles, how then is it used to make a difference in agencies? Because so my biggest concern is I feel like I've seen, like we said, that so many agencies now have hetero, not HIV positive, HIV negative folks that are running the agencies, providing services, making decisions on what programs we need, making decisions on what they write grants for, and not us sitting at the table and making these choices. So if we want to empower people and we create this new version of Denver Principles, how do you then use it to have power, to have weight? How do you do that? How did that happen in the first place?
Of course, the problem isn't that people are heterosexual or that they're HIV negative. It's that we aren't there.
Right.
It's that the people with HIV are not in the same role that we once had. And I don't think it's a matter of rewriting the Denver Principles. I think it's a matter of creating metrics to measure how they are reflected in individual agencies, how they're reflected in the governance, in the bylaws of the agency, how they're reflected in how the agency develops program, develops new services, how they're reflected in how the agency delivers those services. And there are things that can be looked at, and there's lots of research around this, and we need to translate that into some kind of measure so that an agency, we can know, are they going in a better direction, or are they going in the wrong direction? And there are a lot of people running these agencies, positive, negative, straight, gay, whatever, who give the lip service to self-empowerment and believe in that, they don't know how to integrate it into how they run the agency. And that's the help that we need to provide.
That's what I think is so interesting about the model that you said of Housing Works. That would be really interesting to set that up as a model for other people to look at and to see exactly what were the tools that they use, what were the standards they use.
Yeah, just for the benefit of the Housing Works example. And I don't want to set anybody up as perfect, and there are lots of agencies that have specific things that we can really learn from. But Housing Works in their governance, it's set up so that I think a third of their board of directors are elected by the clients of the agency. The staff elects representation on the board. The volunteers elect representation on the board. Their bylaws require a majority of their board to be people of color. When they have job openings, they have a very thoughtful and intentional process to recruit employees from their client base. So their clients, if they're in job training to also be eligible for a job at Housing Works. When I last looked at it, I think Housing Works had about 450 employees, and more than a third of them were former clients of the agency. And there are other agencies that have really kind of innovative things like that. Well, we need to look at that, and we need to measure agencies against these sort of empowerment ideals in governance and service delivery and program development.
I think it's really exciting what you're saying, and I think it's curious as to how I guess if it's so built into the culture of the agency and into the mandates of the agency, the bylaws of the agency, then it really can't stray. I mean, unless you change that. So it was built into the foundation, so that's what makes it so strong. Because I'm like, why does it look so different now in so many HIV service organizations? And I guess because none of that was built in, and the next person gets hired, the next person gets hired. And I'm always looking at agencies and thinking, why are none of the clients being brought in internships, in long-term volunteer training programs, and showing up at the front desk and showing up as case managers in the next year or the next 2 years?
Right. And you look at agencies that have had really bad problems, right? Most recently, AmFAR is a great example, right? And all this drama with Ken Cole and the Harvey Weinstein. Well, you know what? At one point, they didn't have anybody openly living with HIV on their board. Most recently, they only had one person living with HIV on their board. And I believe that if they had had representation on their board from the networks of people with HIV, for example, whose networks give people with HIV the opportunity to select leadership of our choosing, right, and to hold that leadership accountable, rather than have our leaders chosen by somebody else. If AmFAR's board had that kind of representation on it, it never would have gotten to the stage where it's at. You can see this in all sorts of ways. When we are involved in a genuine way, particularly through networks that are accountable to our own constituency, then you see a very different kind of mindset. You see greater urgency, but you also see a different mindset about inclusion and about respect. That I think also translates into better health outcomes and longer longevity.
I really appreciate that. That was a great conversation. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I'm always happy to get on a soapbox on this particular topic, as you can tell.
Thank you.
But I do think there is kind of a renaissance. In the last decade, you had the Positive Women's Network, which is this incredibly vibrant organization with chapters all over. Sero Project, we work very closely with the Positive Women's Network. You now have Thrive, which is mostly focused on young African-American same-sex loving men, positive and negative, with chapters all over growing. You have Positively Trans. Now you finally have a national network of transgender people living with HIV. These networks give an opportunity for us to have a collective voice, to select our own leadership, define our agenda, rather than having us be called in when somebody needs us to support their agenda. So I do think there is something happening right now that is exciting and hopeful. And
it seems like we're following models of, like you said, the women's movement, also Black Lives Matter. Like it feels like it seems so clear to me in looking at that issue regarding HIV empowerment, people with HIV empowerment, is that now that we see those models being relived and reused in like Black Lives Matter, and it just seems so odd to look at an agency and then think, I don't know if there's a single HIV positive person on that board. I don't know if
a
there's
lot
a
of them
single one on
don't
the
have
staff.
any, but the change comes from the bottom up. It comes from the grassroots up. It comes from going to the most vulnerable, the most disenfranchised, bringing them in. That is what creates the tide rising all boats, if you will. It's great that a group of leaders and people I respect tremendously, of incredible accomplishment, and I have a great love. We can sit here and talk, but we can't decide. We can't impose something on a community. It's about going back and empowering people at the very local grassroots level, to with their community advisory board, to their local agency, to serving on the HIV planning councils, and helping provide the guidance to put in place the measures that move us back towards that more effective and authentic peer-to-peer service delivery.
Right. So, and it seems to me that it would be really helpful to have Positively Trans and Positive Women's Network being our allies in requesting that service organizations take on that mantle of this renewed value of we must have HIV positive people placed on boards and in the staff, to say, we want to go back to this old principle that we had, in the early days.
I also say something else that it does is, I believe, I've been living with HIV, as for forever. It's the earliest days. I certainly have an understanding of stigma. There was a time when I weighed 40 some pounds less than I weigh now and was covered in Kaposi sarcoma lesions. And when I'd walk on the sidewalks in the village, mothers would grab their children close and little kids would point and dogs would bark at me. But I think HIV-related stigma is worse today than it has ever been. And a lot of people, particularly HIV-negative people, find that statement startling because they think of stigma in terms of the days when you had to wear a spacesuit to see somebody in a hospital, or somebody wouldn't, touch you, or wouldn't eat at a gay restaurant. There might be a waiter with HIV or something. And that is certainly an expression of stigma, right? It's fear of casual contagion. But stigma, and that has lessened over the years. It's still there, but it's less than it used to be. Stigma is experienced by the stigmatized is more about people making a moral judgment about your worth when they find out you have HIV. It's about being marginalized. It's about being othered. And very importantly, it is about isolation. And a diagnosis today is much more isolating and lonely.
Think that?
Yes, it is. First of all,
why do you think that? I think that's really interesting that you say that.
For one, someone years ago, when someone diagnosed, their concern was not the long-term effect on their career. Their concern was survival to next year. People were more open about their status in the 80s, the early 90s than they are now. Of course, now, someone diagnosed, they have the choice of keeping it a secret. And there are very good reasons why they may want to do that, because it will have an effect on their career and their social relationship. You don't have the connection at diagnosis to other people with HIV that you used to have when you get them in the support group or the network group. No,
interesting.
That doesn't happen. So I think there are a whole series of things that are, and the public perception of people with HIV has changed dramatically. In the 80s and up to the mid 90s, no matter what religious or moral or whatever concerns someone might have about homosexuality or drug use or promiscuity or sex work or whatever, people with HIV were seen through a prism of some measure of human compassion. These are people who were suffering. They were going to die, most likely, possibly a horrific death, maybe very soon. Once effective therapy came out and the understanding spread into the broader culture that we weren't dying, we're going to be around to live longer, we started to be seen differently. Instead of being seen through that prism of our likely death, we were seen through that prism of our survival. And the public health system and the criminal justice system began to define us as an inherent threat. If we're living longer, we're going to be around longer to potentially infect others. So we needed to be sought out, tracked down, tested, reported, listed That's when mandatory names reporting, went into effect in the late 90s, and increasingly criminalized. And the media's played a role. In the earlier years of the epidemic, there was a pretty steady flow of the inspiring human interest stories about the triumph of the human spirit, the woman with AIDS raising her kids and going to work despite dealing with this life-threatening illness. Those have largely gone away. And today, when a person with HIV is referenced by name in the media, more often than not, it's in a criminal context, often with wildly exaggerated kind of AIDS predator and HIV monster, that sort of thing. So I think there are real reasons for it. The stigma is somewhat different in character, but it's in many ways more insidious today. And this isolation is absolutely the case today. In the old times, when you came out as being positive,
I never made that correlation, and I think that is really interesting. How immediately it was like, bring them to other people, have them form a circle, find a place to find comfort.
You had an LGBT community and an HIV community that accepted the epidemic, as a collective responsibility. So when you came out about being positive, you were wrapped in love. We will get through this together.
You're standing in front of the camera.
This is the story of our lives.
He's videotaping.
Anyway, thank you, Greg.
So stupid.
Please stop.
Fucking Mr. Magoo comes walking through the set. Come on in, honey.
Do you guys want to wrap it up so that we can get like a nice close?
Do you want to do a closing?
Let's bring Cleve over here. Let's wrap it up with Cleve.
Well, we can just carry on from him like stumbling through, and then we'll bring him over.
He's our Cleve. You were on today.
You did a beautiful job.
On today. I don't know what you're getting paid for your speeches, but it needs to be more because it was a really.
He agrees.
Don't say that.
Well, I know for the others.
So, do you guys?